At just 9 years old, Ethan was already someone who noticed the small things in life, the details that often slipped past others. He could see the tiredness in his mom's eyes as she came home after long shifts at the hospital, but also the smile she gave him every time she stepped through the door. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect after a grueling day of work. It was the kind of smile that made him feel like the luckiest kid in the world. He knew his mom worked hard for their little family, and it never escaped his notice that every sacrifice she did for him. Ethan walked slowly toward the jewelry store, each step weighed down by the pressure of what was to come. Today, it wasn't about getting home quickly to play or to finish his homework. It was about making his mom feel seen, heard, and loved in a way that went beyond words. The morning had been quiet. His mom had already left for work, and he had been up for hours, waiting for the right moment. He couldn't afford to waste any time. His mom's birthday was fast approaching, and he wanted everything to be perfect. Ethan wasn't one to ask for much. He understood that every penny his mom earned went toward keeping their home running. So when her birthday was just around the corner, he knew he wanted to do something truly special for her, a gift that would show her just how much he appreciated her, how much she meant to him. The past years of his childhood had been filled with the small gestures, a hand-picked card, or a bunch of wildflowers from the park down the street, but this year, he wanted more. He wanted her to know that he saw all of her hard work, that he understood the sacrifices, and that he, too, could do something meaningful. But special things, Ethan knew, weren't free, and that's where the challenge came in. Unlike other kids in his class who had the luxury of extra allowances or birthday money, Ethan didn't have that option. His mom worked tirelessly to provide for them both, but she didn't have much left over for luxuries. So Ethan became resourceful. Over the last few months, he had been collecting coins, pennies, nickels, dimes wherever he could find them. He shoveled snow from driveways during the winter, helped neighbors with groceries, and in return, they'd give him a few coins. Each time, he'd tuck the change into a glass jar hidden under his bed, watching the pile grow little by little. There were no impulsive buys or treats. He even passed on the ice cream his mom had given him money for at school, instead slipping those quarters into the jar. Every penny, every nickel, was one step closer to the perfect gift for his mom. As he reached the corner of Maple Street, he paused to adjust the pouch of coins tucked into his jacket pocket. The wind was biting, and the trees swayed with the rhythm of the coming storm, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was the gift, the only gift he could afford, and how it would make his mom feel. She worked so hard, never asking for anything in return, and he knew this small token would show her just how much he appreciated her. The bell over the door jingled as Ethan entered Goldstein Jewelers, the warm air of the store wrapping around him. He could see the gleam of gold and silver reflecting off the glass, the delicate necklaces and rings calling to him from behind the counter. Mrs. Goldstein, a kind woman with gray hair and a smile that made you feel like family, was behind the counter, dusting a small display case. "Hello, young man. What can I help you with today?" she asked, her voice gentle and full of warmth. Ethan hesitated for a moment, feeling his heart beat faster. I'm looking for something for my mom. It's her birthday next week," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Goldstein's smile widened. "How thoughtful. Do you have something in mind?" Ethan shifted nervously, unsure of how to explain. "Something nice. But I don't have a lot of money," he said, his voice almost lost in the quiet of the shop. Mrs. Goldstein crouched slightly, lowering herself to meet his eyes. There was something about Ethan, his sincerity, his quiet determination that touched her. "Well, let's see what we can find," she said kindly. "What's your budget?" Ethan's cheeks flushed as he placed the pouch of coins on the counter. The jingle of coins echoed slightly in the small store, and he watched as Mrs. Goldstein slowly untied the pouch and counted out each coin with deliberate care, as though recognizing the effort that had gone into collecting each one. $5.72, she said gently, looking up at Ethan with an understanding expression that didn't carry pity, but rather respect for his effort. "Let's see what we can find within that." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He tried to keep his hopes up, but the thought of finding something that would truly make his mom's birthday unforgettable seemed like a far-off dream. But Mrs. Goldstein didn't miss a beat. She scanned the display cases, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully as she pulled out a small silver charm in the shape of a heart. It was understated, but there was an undeniable elegance about it. "This one is special," she said, holding it up for Ethan to see. "It's pure silver, but it's from our older stock. I can let you have it for the amount you've saved." Ethan's face lit up. It wasn't the kind of flashy, extravagant gift he had imagined, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. He could already picture his mom's smile when she opened it, the way she would hold it close and say how much she loved it. "Really?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Really?" Mrs. Goldstein said with a warm smile. "It's perfect for a thoughtful gift." Ethan beamed. "She's gonna love it," he whispered, already imagining the joy on his mom's face. But just as Mrs. Goldstein carefully secured the box, a sound pierced the calm of the store, the sharp screech of tires, the kind that made Ethan's heart jump in his chest. It was followed by the sound of an engine revving, and then the soft hum of the vehicle pulling up to the curb outside. Ethan glanced toward the window, but before he could fully make out the vehicle, the door opened. The soft jingle of the bell above the door rang once again, and in walked a tall, confident figure. His presence seemed to fill the small shop. Even before he spoke, Baron Trump stepped in, flanked by two men in dark suits, who followed him closely like shadows. Baron's tall, lean figure stood out against the softer atmosphere of the store, and his every step seemed deliberate. He had an air of authority that made the room seem smaller, quieter. Even the air itself seemed to shift. Ethan froze, unable to look away. His breath caught in his throat, and his eyes widened. He had seen Baron Trump in the news before, the son of a businessman with a reputation for wealth and power. But seeing him in person, standing in front of him, was an entirely different thing. His sleek, tailored suit and the quiet intensity of his presence made Ethan feel as if the world had stopped for a moment. Baron's sharp features were framed by his neatly combed hair, and his expression was unreadable. The two men in suits didn't speak as they lingered by the door, keeping a distance, but their presence only made Baron seem even more imposing. His gaze swept over the room, taking in the simple display cases, the worn wooden shelves, and then landed on Ethan. Ethan's grip on the counter tightened, his knuckles white. He was suddenly acutely aware of the difference between himself and this man, between the quiet, humble shop and the world Baron seemed to belong to. Baron took a few steps further into the shop, his gaze never leaving Ethan. Ethan could hardly breathe, feeling an overwhelming mix of awe and unease. Mrs. Goldstein, for the first time since Ethan had entered, straightened up. There was no sign of surprise on her face, no flustered movement. She simply greeted him with a calm, composed smile. "Good afternoon, Baron. How may I help you?" she asked, her voice still warm, though it carried a hint of professional recognition. Baron gave a small nod but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked back at Ethan, studying him for a long moment. Ethan didn't know what to make of the silence. He barely dared to breathe. Would Baron say something? Would he look down on him, the boy with nothing but a pouch of coins? But Baron said nothing, at least not yet. Instead, he turned to Mrs. Goldstein and gestured toward one of the display cases, his voice smooth, his words deliberate. "I'm looking for a gift," he said, glancing over at Ethan again. "Something meaningful." Baron Trump's eyes flicked back to Ethan for a moment, lingering just a little too long, as if appraising him, sizing him up. Ethan's palms were clammy, and his stomach twisted with a mix of anxiety and uncertainty. He couldn't help but feel small, insignificant under the weight of the moment. In the presence of someone so wealthy, someone so assured, his few dollars seemed to shrivel into nothing. Mrs. Goldstein, unfazed by the tension, gestured to the gleaming displays of rings, necklaces, and bracelets behind her. "I have just the thing," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "A piece of jewelry that will make anyone feel special, whatever the occasion." Baron didn't seem in a rush, though his gaze shifted back to the shelves, running over the jewelry with a sort of calculated precision. His eyes were sharp, observant, and though his expression remained neutral, Ethan could sense the weight of every decision he made. Each glance seemed to hold the unspoken promise of power, of influence. The very air felt like it shifted around him as he examined the pieces. Mrs. Goldstein, always composed, began presenting options to Baron, who nodded intermittently, his fingers tracing the smooth glass of the cases. Ethan felt his heart race, and he swallowed hard, still gripping the pouch in his hand. His fingers were beginning to feel numb, but the charm, the one that was to be for his mom, seemed to grow heavier in his grasp. But then something strange happened. Baron, still in the middle of his contemplation, finally broke the silence with a low chuckle. Ethan could hardly believe it. Baron turned to him, his eyes no longer cold and distant, but something else, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even amusement. "You're here for a gift, too?" Baron asked, his voice carrying a certain casualness, as if he were genuinely curious. Is that for a birthday? Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. His throat felt dry, and the words caught in his chest. He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture. Yeah, he muttered, his voice weak. For my mom. Her birthday's next week. Baron's lips curved upward, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. That's nice, he said, his tone almost soft, though it still carried that air of superiority. It's always nice to see someone still cares about those things. Ethan had never expected Baron to say something so human. A part of him wondered if it was just an act, some feigned kindness. But another part of him, the part that had always dreamed of a world beyond his small, quiet existence, couldn't help but want to believe it. Maybe Baron wasn't so different from him. After all, Mrs. Goldstein, who had been watching the exchange with quiet amusement, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. With a subtle smile, she turned to Baron and then back to Ethan. I think I may have just the right piece for you as well. Young man, she said warmly. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Could it really be possible that she would let him buy the charm he had been eyeing earlier? That simple, small token of affection that would mean the world to his mom? Baron, too, seemed to notice the small moment of connection between Mrs. Goldstein and Ethan, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were piecing something together. He turned back to Mrs. Goldstein and raised an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? He asked, though his tone was more inquisitive than demanding now. Ethan's grip tightened around the pouch of coins again, suddenly aware of the presence of someone who, by all accounts, had the world at his feet. Baron Trump, the son of a billionaire, standing next to him, a kid from the other side of the tracks. It felt strange, this juxtaposition, two vastly different lives colliding in the same small space. A jewelry shop in the middle of the city. Mrs. Goldstein didn't hesitate. She reached for the small velvet box containing the charm Ethan had been eyeing, holding it out to him with a smile. This one, she said softly, her voice steady, yet filled with an almost reverential quality. It may be small, but it's timeless, and it'll mean something to anyone who sees it. Baron's eyes flicked from the charm in Mrs. Goldstein's hand to the coins Ethan had laid out on the counter, and for the first time, his expression softened. There was no judgment in his gaze, no sneer of superiority. Instead, there was something else, maybe recognition, maybe even respect. He stood there for a moment, as though weighing something in his mind. Before speaking, I think it's a good choice, he said, his voice quieter now, a touch of thoughtfulness beneath the usual confidence. He nodded at Mrs. Goldstein. Wrap it up for the young man, please. Ethan's breath hitched. Wait, you mean for me? He stammered, his words catching in his throat. Was he hearing this right? Was Baron Trump, of all people, suggesting that he buy the charm for him? Baron gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, and his eyes flicked briefly to the counter where Ethan's coins sat. Considerate gesture, he said, his voice steady. You deserve something nice, too. Ethan stood there, frozen, unable to believe what was happening. Mrs. Goldstein, who had been quietly watching the interaction, nodded without missing a beat and began wrapping the charm for him, her hands moving smoothly, as if this was a normal occurrence in the shop. The gesture was a small one, but it felt monumental to Ethan. In a world where everything seemed out of reach, where people like Baron Trump seemed to live lives beyond comprehension, this small moment of kindness, of shared humanity, felt like a dream. Baron turned toward the door, his two men following him silently. As he passed by Ethan, he paused just long enough to offer him one last glance. This time, it wasn't with the same air of aloofness or superiority. It was something else, something more genuine, almost like a silent acknowledgement. Ethan watched as Baron and his entourage left the shop, the door jingling softly behind them. The room felt quieter now, as if the air itself had changed with their departure. Mrs. Goldstein, still with that warm, knowing smile, handed Ethan the velvet box with the charm, her voice filled with kindness. Here you go, young man. It's a small token, but it'll mean the world to someone who appreciates it. Ethan's hands shook as he reached for the box, his fingers grazing the smooth velvet. His mind raced. This was absurd. He had walked into the store with only a few coins to his name, and now he was being given a gift that could change everything. It wasn't just the value of the pendant, it was the thought, the kindness behind it. I don't know what to say, Ethan stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Baron seemed to consider that for a moment, before offering a quiet nod. You don't have to say anything, he said. Just take it and use it to show your mom how much you appreciate her. That's all that matters." Ethan blinked rapidly, trying to stave off the sudden lump in his throat. His mind was still reeling from the shock. He had never been on the receiving end of something like this. Something so generous. His world was filled with struggle, grit, hard work, and the constant fight to make ends meet. And yet here was Baron Trump, someone who seemed to have everything, offering him a gift that would make all the difference to his mom. "Are you sure?" Ethan asked again, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to control it. He needed to be certain. Baron gave him a patient, almost amused smile. "I wouldn't be offering it if I weren't." Ethan carefully closed the velvet box, his hands trembling, but not from fear, from something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain. Gratitude, wonder, disbelief. As Ethan walked out of the store that day, the small gold pendant nestled carefully in his pocket. He couldn't help but feel different. The world seemed brighter somehow, more hopeful, as if Baron's kindness had touched something deep inside him. As he turned the corner towards his apartment, the afternoon sunlight bathed everything in a soft, golden hue. Ethan couldn't wait to share the surprise with his mom, imagining the joy on her face when she saw the gold pendant. When he opened the door to their modest apartment, his mom was sitting on the couch, folding laundry. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she smiled warmly, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Hey, kiddo," she said. "How was your day?" Ethan grinned, trying to keep the excitement in check. "Good. You'll see why next week," he replied, his voice laced with excitement. His mom chuckled and shook her head, clearly intrigued. "You're always up to something, aren't you?" For the next few days, Ethan kept the small wrapped box hidden in his room. He checked it obsessively, making sure the pendant was still safe and sound. Every night, he'd look at it, imagining his mom's reaction when she opened it. The anticipation built up with each passing day. And finally, on the morning of her birthday, Ethan could no longer wait. He walked into the living room, the neatly wrapped box in his hands. "Mom," he said, his voice full of excitement, "this is for you." Her hands froze midair, and a look of pure joy spread across her face. As she carefully opened the box, the golden star pendant shimmered in the light. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she whispered, "Ethan, it's beautiful." Ethan's heart swelled with pride as he beamed at her. "I wanted you to have something special. You're the best mom ever." Without hesitation, his mom pulled him into a tight hug, her tears falling freely now. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Having you is the best gift I could ever ask for." As they held each other, Ethan's mind wandered back to the jewelry store. Baron's unexpected kindness had made this moment possible. And it wasn't just the gift itself, it was the lesson it taught him about generosity, compassion, and seeing the value in others. Ethan knew that what Baron had done wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about making a difference in someone's life. He would carry that lesson with him forever. Baron's gesture wasn't just a gift. It was a reminder of the power of kindness. That sometimes, it doesn't take much to make the world a better place. And as Ethan continued to grow, he made it his mission to pay that kindness forward. Whether it was supporting a friend in need, helping his mom when she struggled, or offering a kind word to a stranger, Ethan lived by the lesson Baron had unwittingly taught him that day. In the end, isn't that the world we all want to live in? A world where small acts of kindness create ripples that grow into waves of change. A world where we recognize the power we all have to make a difference, no matter who we are. So, if this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who could use a reminder about the beauty of kindness. Who knows? Maybe that one act of kindness will inspire them to pass it on, creating a ripple effect that reaches far beyond what we can imagine.